Now, obviously, if you don't live under a rock, you are aware that Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 felony counts of, well, nobody really knows what of, and that's kind of the whole basis of what we're going to talk about. On Thursday, the jury came back in the Manhattan trial with DA Alvin Bragg, who ran on getting Trump. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime. And they found him guilty of all of the things that the prosecution was seeking in that particular case. None of that should be new information to you. Now, there are a couple things that I feel like we should talk about. First, I want to get to this brief outline of what it is and kind of explain why I think a lot of conservatives aren't really worried about that. Probably most notably and pretty immediately after, my friend Charlie Kirk tweeted, hey, look, this signifies something. It'll get thrown out on appeal, which I think it will, and he believes it will. And for that, we're not super concerned about this particular instance. But I think he was talking about, and what I'd like to talk about, is the overall broad idea of what this actually means. Before we get to that, let's briefly explain what happened and why it's so crazy. Now, I'll say this at the onset, and I'm stealing this from Ron DeSantis. Nobody is above the law. And nobody's below the law, meaning that you can't contort the law to make something or someone a criminal by way of maneuvering the law around in order to find that person guilty, which is, I think, exactly what a lot of people think happened with Donald Trump. Partly because what he was charged with, the judge in the trial, the gag orders, the media attention, the jury, where he was being charged, all of that stuff. Now, I'm assuming that you've heard a lot about Judge Merchan, who randomly has gotten a lot of the Trump trials, a lot of the cases involving Donald Trump. His daughter also worked for big-time Democrats and was paid a lot of money. Kind of seems like a conflict of interest. Kind of seems like exactly what they're accusing of Justice Alito. But we'll talk about that in a later segment, the whole flag theory nonsense. But I think the big thing that not enough people are talking about are the charges themselves. I talked a little bit about this on Instagram and wanted to give, I guess, some of my insight as a person who has worked in politics for a very long time. I hate qualifiers. I hate saying, as a political consultant. But in this case, it makes sense. As a person who has worked in politics for a very long time, I will tell you this. Everybody I know, without exception, has run afoul of some sort of election compliance law. What I mean by that is the election laws oftentimes are so convoluted, so difficult to understand, and so easy to screw up given the paperwork that you're filling out and filing with, the Federal Elections Commission, the FPPC in California, whatever your state's election regulation body is. It's so easy to screw that up. It happens to everybody. And I'm not trying to make light of it, but in most cases, it's kind of an accident. It's kind of like, you get pulled over on the freeway or on a road, and the officer says, hey, you were going 60 miles an hour in a 45. And you're like, oh, shoot, sorry. I didn't even know that I was doing that. I wasn't aware. I live in California. Nobody gets in trouble for anything. I assumed that this was legal. It kind of has that kind of vibe. Everybody I know has run afoul of campaign finance violations, including all the way up to Obama. So what I'm trying to say here is that misfiling paperwork, while I'm not excusing it, I'm not saying it's okay to misfile your paperwork, it happens kind of a lot. And generally speaking, it is not a big deal to misfile your paperwork. And that's what this really comes down to. If you're doing, I heard somebody describing this as Trump checked the wrong box in his TurboTax filing of what he paid Stormy Daniels under. Now, quick caveat, and again, I'm sure you've heard this before, the media and the entire intelligentsia class has been saying this is the hush money trial. It is not. That literally has nothing to do with it. Paying off somebody, while I believe is probably not the right thing to do from a moral standpoint, to talk, especially if you're having an affair with them and you don't want that affair to come to the public light and you want them to keep quiet, while I would probably disagree with that on a moral standpoint, not illegal. So the whole idea of calling it a hush money trial is ridiculous and stupid in and of itself. So the hush money part of it has kind of nothing to do with this except the fact that when filing the campaign contributions, Trump or whoever's accountant was marked it as, well, this is legal expenses. Which, caveat on caveat on caveat, if I were paying off a porn star that I was having an affair with, and I didn't want that person to keep quiet, what box do you check? Do you check off paying porn star that you had an affair with? No, you probably would rightly categorize it as a business expense or a legal expense. But the whole idea, again, I don't want to re-explain the entirety of the case. I'm making my way to a point here. But the idea is that Michael Cohen paid off Stormy Daniels to keep her mouth shut, and then Trump, in paying Cohen back for the quote-unquote hush money, well, I guess it is actually hush money, but again, that's not illegal, marked it as a legal expense. Okay, fine. All of that, I guess, happened. I am of the belief that Donald Trump did have an affair with Stormy Daniels, even though I think he probably is denying it at this point, or continuing to deny it. But at the end of the day, I think all of that stuff happened, and probably, maybe, a campaign violation was committed. The question is, how big of a deal is that? The federal government, by the way, did not think it was a big deal. So instead, the DA in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, decided to prosecute in his state a federal crime that accounts for a misdemeanor. All of these things I'm sure you've heard, but this is what I think is being talked about the least and matters the most. So Alvin Bragg charges Donald Trump with a misdemeanor crime. Well, it's not a misdemeanor, it's a felony. It's 34 counts of a felony. Okay. Well, again, as a person who has run afoul of these same laws and, you pay a fine for it, again, including Obama paid a fine for misfiling campaign paperwork, which is, again, not condoning that, but also it happens. You get caught speeding, you blow a stop sign, or you roll through a stop sign. I don't know. Things aren't that big of a deal. So Alvin Bragg takes these misdemeanor crimes and bumps them up to a felony. Well, then the question becomes, well, how did they bump them up to a felony? This is the thing that I think people have talked about but aren't talking enough about. Well, the reason he bumped it up to a felony is that the claim from the prosecution was, well, it is a misdemeanor to falsify business records, in this case, campaign finance disclaimers. It is a misdemeanor, but in this particular case, it is elevated to a felony because the misdemeanor in question was only committed to cover up another pre-existing or attempt to commit another crime. In other words, and more plainly put, it's only a felony because they're saying that the paperwork filing was trying to secretly hide another crime. Okay, fine. I understand that legal theory. Don't you think, though, then, if your crime is being elevated from a misdemeanor to a felony because the suggestion is that you were attempting to cover up another crime, don't you think that other crime should be made public? Don't you think that the supposed other crime that elevated this to a felony should be told to the defense? Put yourself in those shoes. If you were being tried for a crime, a misdemeanor crime, I don't know, who cares what it is? And they say, well, it's no longer a misdemeanor, it's actually a felony because you only committed this misdemeanor infraction because you were attempting to hide another crime. You probably would want to know, okay, well, what was the other crime that you're accusing me of? Not being convicted of, not being even charged with, but accusing me of. Well, they said, well, we're not going to tell you. Wouldn't you also go, wait a minute, my crime is being elevated to the next level of severity, but you won't tell me why that is? Yeah, isn't that a problem? This is one of the big reasons I think why a lot of conservatives aren't super concerned about this. They think, or they know, hopefully it'll be thrown out on appeal. The question is, when will the appeal happen? Most people think the appeal at that particular New York state level won't happen until after the election. Some people think the Supreme Court is going to come in and say, well, we have to decide this because states could eventually start taking Trump off the ballots because they don't allow for quote-unquote convicted felons to vote or run for president, or at least I've been told by several other people. So if that's the case, then the Supreme Court could expedite the appeal. But the bottom line is, the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution is pretty clear that in order to be charged with the crime, you have to know in specific detail what that crime is. As a matter of fact, that was part of the reason we formed this whole country. The colonies in addition to being taxed without representation, were in many cases, if they were deemed quote-unquote troublemakers in the colonies, brought before the king on trumped-up charges, not told what they were being charged with, and then were thrown in jail or punished for the crimes that they weren't really even sure would happen. The whole idea of this country is based on the fact that justice is a thing, and you can only achieve justice if the person in defense is fully aware of the crime that they're being charged with. You know, take out the layers of escalating a crime to the next level of severity, and you have a situation where somebody's in a courtroom and the judge is saying, well, you're being charged. And you ask, well, with what? What did I do? I'm not sure, and I'd like to mount my defense based on knowing what I did or what you claim that I did. And they say, nope, you can't know. And then the jury votes, are you guilty or are you not guilty? And you're sitting there going, I don't even know what I did wrong. I feel a lot of that. I feel that way when something gets taken down from social media, Facebook or YouTube, but that's, again, beside the point. But the bottom line is, I think it's going to get thrown out on appeal because of that reason specifically, because the elevation of the misdemeanor crime to the felony level, the fact that Alvin Bragg prosecuted a federal crime in the States, the fact that the judge, all of that stuff being said, I am not concerned that this is going to actually be able to hold its water at the end of the day. Couple things I want to point out here too. I said this on some forum, I don't know, that while I think it is justified that a lot of conservatives are up in arms, rhetorically speaking, about the fact that Trump is now a felon, saying, I'm going to vote for a felon and making light about this, I would caution us against making light of the use of the term felon. Because of all the reasons I just explained, I don't think Trump will actually be a felon in terms of being a convicted person of a crime. I think that'll get thrown out on appeal and he will no longer be a felon. And so what I would caution us against doing is calling him a felon and, in effect, glorifying that term, because at the end of the day, remember, we are the side of law and order and justice. We don't want to be in the position where we're making light of a real term that has real implications and that actually means something. And even more than that, we don't want the lefties to conflate our use of the term felon and then say, well, your morals are just as relative as ours because you're saying being a felon is good now. That's the last thing I think we want ultimately. So at the end of the day, let's hold off on being so, hooray, we're voting for a felon, even though I know it doesn't change anything in our minds. That's what I'd like to hold off on. The second thing I'd love to talk about here is, what did this actually do? If I were a Democrat strategist and I was trying to plot a path to victory in November of 2024, especially to the White House, do I think that this helped or hurt my particular objective? Again, if I'm a Democrat and I'm trying to get Joe Biden reelected, what happened here? Did anybody change their mind about this? The answer, I think, is absolutely not. I think the people that were already going to vote for Trump are still going to vote for Trump, and the people that weren't going to vote for Trump aren't going to vote for Trump still. There was some poll, I forget who it was, but it was like 15% of people said that this is going to affect my disdain or whatever for Donald Trump. And my thought is, okay, well that means 85% of people say that, well, it won't affect that. And also, who are those 15% of people? Are they people that already hated Donald Trump and now that he is quote-unquote a convicted felon, hate him more? Okay, well that poll then does nothing for us. Did it actually help the Democrat side putting their opponent in jail, or did it hurt their political case? I would argue that it hurt their political case. It isn't even a wash. I think conservatives / Republicans are rallying behind a guy that even if they don't really like him, and I've been open in saying this, I think it would have been easier to win with another Republican candidate who wasn't Donald Trump. But you don't get to choose your heroes. Somebody said that and I'm stealing that, but at the end of the day, you don't get to choose who your heroes may be. And like it or not, whether you agree with this term or not, Donald Trump by default being the guy who stood up to the people who are willing to pervert justice is in fact now the hero of this story, whether you like it or not. The last question that we have to answer to ourselves is, as a whole of society, was it worth it? Was the political prosecution which I believe it is, and I think a majority of the country believes it is, worth the turmoil that this is going to cause going forward. Because it should be obvious and it should be apparent that a lot of people on the conservative side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, who have not played dirty, for lack of a better term, for a long time, are now looking at this going, this crosses a line. This is Caesar crossing the Rubicon headed back into Rome. This is a monumental shift in the way that we do things. And because of that, why not lock her up, as people so fervently chanted in 2016, only to have Donald Trump, after he was president, say, we're not going to do anything about that. Why not? And the question now has a lot more validity considering the fact that, well, they just did it. Why wouldn't, let's just say, I don't know, give me some red city that Joe Biden gave a speech at 30 years ago. Why wouldn't that district attorney say, well, Joe Biden mislabeled his campaign finance, I don't know, invoice when he gave this speech and was making this amount of money? Why not? Again, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a good road for us to go down in this tit-for-tat world, but it's getting more and more difficult to make the argument as to why we shouldn't. If they're going to do it to people on our side and do it to a person at that level, who's to say they won't do it to you? And if you need to eliminate your concern of it happening to you, wouldn't you want to have it happen to the other side too? Again, I'm not making the argument for it. I'm just saying it's becoming increasingly more difficult to make the argument of not playing at their level, which again is a bad place to be in America.